Good morning. Good morning. For those of you that do not know me, I am Linda Duhon-McCour. I am the outreach coordinator for the Tyrrell Historical Library. We welcome you here this morning, and if you didn't sign in when you first came in, please do so before you leave, because that's how we keep up with all the people that come through the library. Again, if you don't know, the bathrooms are right down here at the end. You just take a left and then a right, and the bathroom is there. So we welcome you, and I'd like to welcome our speaker this morning, Miss Allie.
Hi.
You want to come up?
Hi everyone. So my name is Alexandra Humphrey. I am the current director at the Edison Plaza Museum here in Beaumont. We're a small nonprofit museum that's dedicated to the life and work of Thomas Edison. So if that's something that interests you, please do stop by and see us. We also house some antique electronics such as old TVs, refrigerators, things we still use in daily life, but they look very different than what we have today. So I'm going to talk to you today about Edison, the Telegraph, and the Titanic. And one thing that has never ceased to amaze me when it comes to Edison in this time frame of the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s is just how many things you can link back with him, whether it's an invention that somehow evolved or an event or even make a link with World War I. So linking these three things together was pretty easy, and I think it will really help to prove how influential something as outdated as the telegraph was in the everyday life in the early 1900s. So what exactly is the telegraph? Now the telegraph is attributed to Samuel Morse, and it was developed in 1835. And it's a system of communication that I think today we would consider fairly rudimentary, but back then was very cutting edge. And it sends information by making and breaking electrical connections. And that's what gives it the unique sound that we so well associate with it. So Morse code, which was named for Mr. Morse, was a way of encoding alphabetical letters with a series of what's become known as dots and dashes. And these are what you would type over the telegraph, and someone listening on the other end could easily transcribe what you were sending to them. And this is something that many considered to be easy to learn and useful for sending communication over such a large distance, because this was the first time that you could send something without having to write a letter or send someone in your stead to tell something, and the first time that it was really transmitted over the radios. So this would be something that today would be akin to our telephone, just without speaking words, you were using a code. Now the first time this was demonstrated was May 24th, 1844, and the message was, "What hath God wrought?" So what does this have to do with Mr. Edison? So Edison was born on February 11th, 1837, and this was 2 years after the telegraph made its debut. And at that time, a lot of children were taking jobs, and after somewhat failing out of formal education, the teacher considered him adult, said his mother, you can't teach him, he can't learn. And he probably suffered from something akin to what we call ADHD nowadays. So his mother educated him at home, but since he was home, he took a job. And this would help bring an income to his family and give him some spending money. And he worked on the railroad. And what we know of that time is a lot of people that worked with trains ended up taking up the telegraph system. So at age 15, Edison saved a small boy that had wandered on to the railroad tracks, and the boy's father was so thankful that he taught Edison how to do Morse code and work as a telegraph operator. So from 1863 to 1867, Edison traveled as a telegraph operator, and this was important because during this time we had the Civil War going on. A lot of information was being moved very quickly, and working as an operator may very well have spared Edison joining up into the war effort, and who knows where we would have been if he hadn't proceeded to adulthood. So in 1868, he took a job for the Western Union, which was a famous telegraph company, and continued inventing while working with the telegraph. And one of the things that I always find interesting is we tend to think of Edison as someone that's so driven and so hardworking, but a lot of his employers from the telegraph actually said he was not. He was not a good employee, and that's because he was constantly inventing. And a lot of his first inventions had to do with the telegraph and sending more than one message, receiving more than one. Several of his patents, especially in the early days, were over the telegraph system. Now, in 1869, he invented the electronic stock ticker and sold that for $40,000. And that's what he invested in his Menlo Park laboratory and somewhat rerouted his life. But one of the things is that the telegraph never truly left him. Morse code was something he remained passionate about through his lifetime. He nicknamed his children Dot and Dash because of Morse code. He was hard of hearing and would often communicate to his second wife by tapping on her wrist. He taught her Morse code. He proposed to her in Morse code. So that's something that he held with him for a long time. Now, having spoke about Edison and having spoken about Samuel Morse, there are other men that were working on telegraph systems. Nicholas Tesla is probably famously remembered as having worked on a wireless system. Well, in Italy, there was a man named Guglielmo Marconi, and he is credited with pioneering the use of radio waves for sending telegraph messages in 1894. And this would eventually lead to us being able to send things over the oceans and for ship-to-shore communication. So he was born on the 25th of April in 1874, and kind of like Edison, he had no formal in-school education. His parents hired tutors, and they taught him at home. And his father was Italian, while his mother was British, and later his father would move over and have citizenship in England so that his children had the option going forward. So a lot of what we see in Marconi's later days is through the use of England and British channels. At the age of 20, he began experimenting, building his own radio waves systems and using his father's land to put antennas and to experiment sending the waves. And eventually he realized that by raising the height of his antennas and grounding his transmitter and receiver, he could send them 2 miles even across hills. So in 1896, he traveled to London to get further investment on the system, and in just 2 short years, the British Lightship Service established the first wireless communication. And this proved really helpful because the Elba, which was a ship back then, had run aground and was able to make a distress call that reached a lighthouse on land. So there was obviously a need for this system, and it was being proven. In 1902, the Marconi Transmission Station was established in Glace Bay, Nova Scotia, and it was the first to send messages across the Atlantic. 5 years later, they began to put his system onto the ships, and so we had sailing vessels that were able to communicate. And ultimately, in 1909, he won a Nobel Prize in Physics for his use on this. And the Marconi radio system is so important because this is the radio system that they ultimately chose to put on the Titanic. So Marconi himself was actually offered passage on the Titanic, being that his radio system was going to be on there, and fate intervened, and he ended up turning down the ticket so that he could take a different boat going 3 days sooner and work while on board. His family was supposed to continue on the Titanic and join him, but once again, fate intervened because his son fell ill, and they ended up staying behind. However, his wife and daughter did attend the launch of the Titanic, and it was something that they held with them for the rest of their life. Let's see here. Okay. So moving forward and kind of getting more to the Titanic side of things and away from the telegraph, we have another major player in the world that rises up, and that is J.P. Morgan. So J.P. Morgan first got introduced into technology when he invested in Edison's electric illuminating company in 1878. He became a very famous backer and investor in several different areas, including Nikola Tesla's wireless company, which we see was beat out by Marconi's system. In 1902, his company, International Mercantile Marine Company, purchased the White Star Line, which was the shipping company responsible for the lines of Titanic. He offered the shareholders 10 times the value of their profits as generated in 1900. And 1900 was a very good year. Now, there was one skeptical holdout of this, and this is a man who, for anyone that has done anything with Titanic, you instantly know the name, J. Bruce Ismay. Any Titanic movie, he is there. And he was the chief executor of the White Star Line. Now, initially he held out because he didn't feel that his father would appreciate the transfer ship, but he was swayed, and eventually they did sell to J.P. Morgan. Now, J.P. Morgan, who was an American, was buying a British company. So they decided that the company would remain British, but all the financial would be American. J. Bruce Ismay, as the executor, was really the brainchild behind Titanic. And this would be in the Olympic class of liners, and this was the first time that we were seeing this development of ships. There would be three. There would be Titanic, Olympic, and Britannic. They would measure 882 feet long and 92.5 feet at their widest point. Now, to construct these ships, they turned to Harland and Wolff, which was in Belfast, Ireland, and in 1909, the work on Titanic's hull began. 2 years later, they began working on her lavish interior and installing the 29 boilers. And for anyone who has ever seen pictures of those beautiful wood carvings, of the carpet, you can really understand the work that went into the interior of this ship. And it was very much the heart of the ship and what was going to bring you those passengers that you so desperately wanted. Now, in 1912, Titanic was the biggest ship on the ocean. She cost $7.5 million to make, and roughly, when I put this in to an inflation calculator, it came up as $400 million. The ship could carry just over 3,500 passengers and crew. It boasted 840 staterooms, 9 decks, a swimming pool, and of those rooms, 416 were first class, 162 were second class, and 262 were in third class. But what did she have for safety in the beginning? She had 16 watertight compartments that extended up to her F deck. She was equipped to carry 64 lifeboats, over 3,500 life jackets, and 49 life buoys. So when we look at those numbers, it's really hard to imagine the tragedy that's going to come. But what would it have been like to travel on Titanic? When she set sail, she had 2,223 passengers, 885 of those were crew, and then 1,316 were passengers. Of the passengers, 325 were traveling first class. Now, a parlor suite in first class would cost roughly 870 pounds, or just over $100,000 today. But what could you expect for that? You had a lavish stateroom with carpet. Many of their suites had adjoining rooms for your servants. You had a private promenade deck. Every day they would change your linen. And of course, these sheets were not washed on board. They had to wait to dock for fresh water. So they were changing linen just to save the dirty linen. You could have tea time in your room in the morning, which came with fresh pastries. You had access to fine dining, access to a gym, a pool, massage, Turkish bath. They had a private men's smoking room, library. You had access to that beautiful grand staircase that is featured in everything that you see. And then, of course, to eat, you could enjoy luxuries such as smoked salmon, grilled mutton, and fresh fruit. Second class on her maiden voyage had 285 people and cost roughly 12 pounds or about $1,200 today. And this is more of what I would think you and I would imagine of going on a cruise now. It wasn't quite as lavish, but still luxury. You still had the library. You had a private smoking area, access to a barber. There was a single dining room that had a piano and would double for church service on Sunday. And you could be offered food such as eggs, ham, and lamb. So not a bad way to travel. Now, third class and White Star Line was known for having a luxury not seen on other ships, even when it came to third class. So on her maiden voyage, there were 706 third-class passengers, and they paid between £3 and £8, or $300 to $800 today. You would have a communal cabin, which had no more than 10 people. Men would have a smoking room with its own bar, and there was a large public area where you could have parties and socializing. Meals would include oatmeal, cold meat, and cheese. And all of this got the ship ready to set sail on April 10th, 1912 from Southampton, England. So as we spoke about the passenger accommodations, let's talk about the room that held the wireless radio. And this was known as Marconi rooms en suite. And they began installing them in 1903. And it was viewed as a potentially life-saving system to justify the installation, because if anything happened, you could get word out. They also offered a luxury aspect because they allowed passengers to pay money to send out their own personal messages. For 12 shillings and 6 pence, you could get 10 words of a Marconigram. This is probably about $70 today. And people on these ships that had the luxury and had the wealth, this is something they wanted to do. Because if you could send this from the ship to someone waiting back home, you were sending a message. So they had many of these messages go out on ships, even not the Titanic, but you could handle your business affairs. It was a selling point to be able to communicate outside of the ship. Now, the Marconi suite on the Titanic had 3 rooms. They had the silent room, which housed all of their spark gear, because it could be very loud, and they were concerned that it might interfere with that lavish first-class experience if they had to hear this radio. And the room was located by the grand staircase in the entrance in first class because they were going to be the ones sending the messages, and because it needed to be as close to the top of the ship as possible for the antennas to work. Now, inside the suite, there was a small bunk for the operators because they were expected to work in shifts 24 hours a day, and the actual radio room where they could transmit the messages. This Marconi radio was the most powerful at sea and could reach New York or London from the middle of the ocean. And one interesting fact is that the operators were still employed by Marconi and not by the White Star Line. So who were these operators that have become so famous from their actions on Titanic? You had the assistant operator, Mr. Harold Bride, who was born in January of 1890. After primary school, he decided that he wanted to be a telegraph operator, and he worked in his family business and able to pay for his training. He completed his training in July of 1911 at the Marconi Company. His chief telegraph operator, Jack Phillips, was born in April of 1887, so just a few years older. After school, he took a job at the local post office where he learned telegraphy. 4 years later, in 1906, he began working for the Marconi Company, and at the age of just 19, he was fully certified. And if you look, his birthday is April 11th, 1887, and Titanic set sail April 10th, so he celebrated his 25th birthday on that voyage. On the night of April 14th, tragedy struck, and we all know what happened that night. At about 11:30, a lookout spotted an iceberg, and we know from looking at certain things that there was probably some kind of optical illusion at play with the night air and the sea, which did make it hard to view this iceberg. But at about 11:30, the ship struck, and several people say they barely felt anything on board. Some say they did, and what we know is that a 300-foot gash was cut across the bottom of the ship. Ice poured onto the deck. You've seen children playing with the ice. You'd see men picking it up and putting it in their drinks. And overall, it was still a joyous time. Nobody had any clue what the next couple of hours would bring about. Now, the night before this event, the radio system had broken on Titanic, and Phillips had actually gone against Marconi policy and began to repair the radio. Marconi felt that they could do more damage than good, so operators should not repair such radios. But he did, and he got it working. The issue was the men had become backlogged in the amount of personal messages that they needed to send out. So Phillips and Bride had been working hard, feverishly trying to send out these messages and field in the calls coming to the ship. And we have some testimony from Bride, some firsthand account. So the next few things I'm going to tell you are things that he actually voiced later on in the Titanic inquiry as a sort of the steps and the events that came about. He claimed that the first report of ice came at about 5 p.m. from the California, and she said, quote, 3 large bergs 5 miles to southward of us, regards, and listed her coordinates. The men then delivered the message to the bridge, but not to the captain directly because it did not mention needing to go to the captain directly, and this was fairly commonplace. Bride said he was relieved from duty and went to dinner at some time between 6 and 7. He was set to go back on duty at 2 a.m., but he intended to wake up a bit early to help Phillips because he knew how hard he was working. So he figured he would relieve him about midnight. He woke up, said he hardly felt anything. He didn't feel a jolt, but at midnight went to relieve Phillips. And that's when Captain Smith popped into the cabin and told the men that they had struck something, that they were assessing the damage, and that they should prepare to call for distress, but not to do it quite yet. He then left, and what Bride estimated to be about 10 minutes later, reemerged and asked them to please send CQD, which means come quickly, distressed, and that was the adopted distress call in 1905. Several ships responded to this call, and most famously was probably the Carpathia, who acknowledged it and told them that she was turning around at full speed and heading towards them. During that night, Captain Smith moved back and forth between the bridge and the Marconi room. Bride began to see that the ship was now listing to port, and he recalled that in a moment of humor, he said that I cut in with a little remark that made us all laugh, including the captain. Send SOS, it's the new call, and it may be your last chance to send it. At this point, Phillips agreed, and he began sending both CQD and SOS as distress calls to other ships. At 2 a.m., Captain Smith once again came into the room. He told the men they had done their duty and that it was time to abandon ship and relieved them. But Phillips continued to work. He continued to send out messages, to receive messages. Bride recalled sparks flying in the room, water filling in, and as the power began to fade on the ship, so did the wireless ability to function. It wasn't until he could no longer get a signal did Philip choose to abandon post. And it was at this point, and I believe I've seen it in some movies, where you see the men in the wireless room and someone comes and attempts to take Philip's life vest. And this is something that actually happened. And the men did have to fight back. And at that point, they decided to try and seek safety. So once they got to the deck, the men split up. And of course, since we have Bride's testimony, we know that he did survive that night. He was able to join some men that were trying to free the collapsible lifeboat B. They were washed overboard into the water with the lifeboat, and 30 of those men spent the night on top of that lifeboat, swaying with the waves to stay afloat. They were able to be rescued and loaded into other lifeboats and were brought onto the Carpathia. Bride himself suffered frostbite and crushing injury to both feet. But despite that, he joined the Carpathia's operator in the wireless room to send information on those that had survived and what had happened that night. He did stay in the hospital in New York City briefly and testified at the Titanic inquiries and was also featured in the New York Times article, thrilling story by Titanic surviving wireless men. Afterwards, he returned to England. He served as a telegraph operator in the First World War. In 1919, he was married and he had 3 children. One thing that they always commented on is how much he hated discussing the Titanic. He was truly traumatized, but he did say, "Never take life for granted. The Titanic taught me the importance of cherishing every day." Later in life, he worked as a traveling salesman and then a live-in caretaker at Provan Hall in a National Trust property near Glasgow. He died April 29, 1956, of lung cancer. But what of Phillips? We know that the men split up once they reached the deck, and Phillips' fate becomes cloudy after leaving Bride. Some claim that he did make it onto Collapsible B like Bride and perished due to exposure sometime during the nights. Others believe this is false. There was one credible person who thought Phillips was on board because someone was pointing out where ships should be coming from and that they had communicated with them. Many now believe that this was Bride and not Phillips. There was a man who did perish on the lifeboat, and his body was removed to Carpathia. So it's possible that Phillips was one of the 4 men that was buried at sea. But it's unknown, and his body, if recovered, was never found. However, his actions that night aided the survivors that were eventually rescued by the Carpathia. So let's talk about the facts of that night, or the things that maybe should have been different. Many lifeboats had been removed from the ship because it was simply more aesthetic not to have a cluttered deck. So of those 64 that were originally there, only 20 were available that night. The ship sank at about 2:20 in the morning on April 15th. It sank in about 2 hours and 40 minutes. The water was estimated to be 28 degrees. 68% of passenger and crew died. 705 survivors were found, and only 333 bodies were recovered. That means there were 1,500 people lost. The crew, followed by third class, suffered the biggest loss on the ship. And one of the most sombering facts for me is that of the 128 children on board, 61 were lost. And that included one child in first class because her nanny grabbed her brother and made it to the lifeboats, and her mother, who couldn't find her brother, refused to leave without him. So she was the only first class child to perish that night. The ship sank to the ocean floor, which was about 13,000 feet, and the free fall destroyed the structure of the Marconi room. However, they do believe that some of the radio within is still intact, and there is some effort of trying to salvage it and put it back in working order. During the 36 hours that Titanic was on the ocean, 250 Marconiographs, those personal messages, were sent by Bride and Phillip. So what happened in the aftermath of this? There was a point where they believed that the radio men may have played a bigger role in things and may actually have been to blame. There were some people that thought Bride was withholding information to sell later on. And so they began to hold what has been known as the Titanic inquiries. The first was the American inquiry developed by William Alden Smith. And these really came about when it was known how many lives were lost. When it was known how big of a tragedy it was, they really wanted to know what happened and how they could fix it. So he set up a committee which was equal parts Democrats and Republicans, and it was somewhat rushed because word was getting out that Bruce Ismay and some of the other crew members that had survived were going to be traveling back to England as quickly as possible. So in order to avoid them being able to leave, they began the inquiry on April 19th, 1912 in New York City. It lasted 18 days with over 80 witnesses, and those included Bride, as I told you, with his testimony, and even Marconi himself, who testified as to the role of the operators and certain practices and the technology. England formed their own inquiry under Lord Mersey, and it employed assessors that were only in the maritime field. So these were complete experts at what could go wrong with a ship. They began on April 22nd, 1912, and their inquiry cost them 20,000 pounds, which was the highest court proceeding of that time. It lasted 42 days with over 100 witnesses, and the overall finding of the court is as follows. The court, having carefully inquired into the circumstances of the above-mentioned shipping casualty, finds for the reasons appearing in the annex hereto that the loss of said ship was due to collision with an iceberg, brought about by the excessive speed at which the ship was navigated. So as you can see, no mention of missing messages or hidden secrets. It was simply the fact that the Titanic, that had a top speed of 23 knots or 26 miles an hour, was being pushed to her top limit. And that was because they thought if they could arrive early, it would show luxury and speed. The following year, there were many things that happened, and people were still remembering Titanic. A slip for Edison's record, Nearer My God to Thee, stated, when the great steamship Titanic sank in the mid-ocean in April 1912, it was being played by the band and sung by the doomed passengers, even as the boat took her final plunge. So you can see people are still remembering this. And it wasn't really until 1914 when we began to see improved safety measures as a direct action of this. In 1914, they had the formation of the International Convention for the Safety of Life and Sea and the International Ice Patrol. New safety protocols on ships call for lifeboat drills, enough lifeboats for everyone, an on-duty radio operator 24/7, as it was found that one operator on board a nearby ship was sleeping at the time that these messages were being sent, and more unified distress signals. We had CQD, we had SOS, other companies had their own. So we needed these to be unified so people could truly understand. In the years that followed, hundreds of lawsuits were launched against the White Star Line, seeking more than $16 million. In 1916, they were settled for just $664,000. In the late 1920s, the White Star Line was sold to the Royal Mail Steam Packet Company for $7 million. So as we've talked about the tragedy and the key players within the tragedy, I did do some research to discover some Texans that were on board the Titanic, or maybe people coming to Texas later in life. So at our exhibit, we will highlight a few more, but right here I'd just like to speak over a couple. We had a James Bracken. He traveled second class and spent much of his youth in Hale, Texas. In 1912, he was returning home from a business trip. He perished, and if found, his body was never identified. His widow claimed that he had all of their money as he was coming back from business, and this prompted the Red Cross to take up donations which totaled $100. Her family claimed she never accepted the money. Samuel and Emma Risen were traveling third class. They are recorded as living in Limestone, Texas in 1910. They spent much of their time in South Africa, as it's rumored that Emma's family was involved in diamond mining. The family lore says that they were bringing back several diamonds on board the Titanic and traveled third class to stay unnoticed. They both perished, and if found, were never identified. Bridget Driscoll was traveling third class. She was a recent immigrant, had come to New York, but had returned to Ireland in 1911 to look after her sick mother. She was returning to New York on this trip. She survived in an unknown lifeboat and moved to Houston, Texas later in life before passing away in 1976. I would also like to mention, if you are interested in the Telegraph, that here at the Tyrrell Library, they do have information over Tom Russell, who was born in 1836 and served in the Confederate Army. In 1869, he set up the first telegraph office here in Beaumont. So you can learn some history of how these came to be. And if you read the history of the telegraph here in Beaumont, they had a hard time keeping people off the wires. They kept stealing them and tearing them down. So it is very interesting some of the facts you could find here at the Tyrrell Library about that. Eventually, Tom Russell became a county attorney for Jefferson County in 1876, and in 1894, he was on the populist ticket for Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the state of Texas. So in closing, I just hope that you take away from this how important the history of these items are, how without the telegraph, we wouldn't have a telephone. It seems so rudimentary now to talk to someone by clicking a button and back and forth, but it really is just an amazing contribution. And of course, Edison, who contributed, and his many patents on the work. And then some people like Bride and Philip, who just went above and beyond during tragedy. Philip was lost. If he had abandoned post earlier, would he have lived? You never know. But we will be highlighting a poster exhibit over this at the Edison Museum this summer. I'm hoping to have it up next week. I'm waiting for my posters to get here. So I did bring information about that if you guys would like to see it. And like I said, we will have more information than what's in here. There'll be more Texans. There'll be a more roundabout idea if you would like to come see that. We are open Monday through Friday, 10 to 2. We are also hosting a couple other events this summer. We are doing a Pokemon Day for kids with the Energy Museum. That'll be tomorrow we have one, and then July 9th and July 16th. You can come to us and trade Pokemon cards, make some origami, and then you can go to the Energy Museum and learn how to play Pokemon cards and what role energy plays when you're talking a trading card game. I will also be giving this speech in a more kid-friendly role at the Groves Library next month. And then in September, we always do an exhibit over the 1900 storm that features photographs from the Rosenberg Library and how Edison came into play with that one as well. So I hope that everyone will come by and see this exhibit and give me your thoughts. Thank you so much. Should I stay for questions or like? Yeah. So if you look over here, I did bring some telegraph keys, and I had some books, but I could not find the box. But you can see how the little button, you would click it, and that would make the connection and break the connection, and make it and break it. And we have a machine that generates Morse code, and I don't know how they learned it. I know they say it's easy, and no. But it is certainly an interesting technology. Yeah. They are kind of heavy. And this one would probably be more for your traveling because it comes with a nice little box.
Write something. Ellie, we want to thank you for coming.
Oh, no problem.
Yeah. And if you haven't had an opportunity to go to the museum, you definitely need to. It is really a fabulous place.
We try to do temporary stuff all the time, so follow us on Facebook or give us a call. And
I just had a comment. I know that until recently, to get a ham radio license, amateur radio license, you were required to learn Morse code, which I did.
Oh, my
And
goodness.
Oh, wow.
Back in the 70s. So I don't know if that's still a requirement or if it's strictly, voice amateur radio now.
That's neat.
Back in the day, I learned Morse code. I don't remember it.
It's
Well,
not required.
it's not? Okay.
But I didn't know.
And I know the railroads have used it because
Yeah.
I had a good friend who, I think up until the 80s or something.
Oh, probably.
Yeah, they used the telegraph.
I mean, I know I get visitors that know Morse code or say they learned it at some point. So, I mean, it's still prevalent, but, I listen to that machine all day when the kids type on it, and it sounds the same.
My grandfather, who was born in 1879, was a telegrapher in Petoskey, Michigan, on the railroad. And he saw my grandmother walking across the tracks and decided he wanted to see who that young lady was. But anyway, he did that. He later became a doctor, but that's how he started out, was for the railroad.
Well, he would have been by Edison because Edison would have been in Ohio when he was doing his.
Time. Yep,
And then, of course, I've got some information here about the exhibit and here about the museum if anyone would like to take one.